Okay, welcome to American History, AP US History by Coach Norman. Chapter 1, New World Beginning. So, the beginning of American history begins with the first migration of people from Asia into the Americas. According to most historians and geologists, you can see they're crossing from Asia through Alaska into North America and all the way down into South America. So, what they did is they crossed over from glaciers during the Ice Age across something called the Bering Land Bridge, where that water had been frozen. Most believe that they followed some wandering herds of animals like woolly mammoths or some other beasts, and after the ice melted, they were left isolated from the rest of the world, especially Asia and Europe. So the beginning of America really is these soon to be Native Americans moving away from their former land following opportunity known as, well, food. So again, there's that picture there. You can see they migrate all across the Americas and settle in many different peoples, becoming dozens and then hundreds and then thousands of tribes here. So, where do peoples in the Americas come from? When do they go from those wandering nomadic peoples into dense populations and create societies? So, societies are created by agriculture. Without agriculture, society simply can't be supported. So, in America, these societies were supported when in Central America they discovered three sister farming. Basically, they were able to grow three different crops in the same area that did not take nutrients from each other. These three crops are maize, which is also known as corn, beans, and squash. Once they perfected the ability to grow these crops together, they were able to feed hundreds and then thousands of people living in the same location, and that allowed society and civilization to form. The most famous and complex of these civilizations were formed first in Central and South America. You have the Incas, the Mayans, and the Aztecs. These three groups formed massive empires that had commerce, had mathematicians, of course, the Mayans being famous for their calendar. The Aztecs themselves are famous for their large pyramids where they had human sacrifices to their gods. And the Incas in Peru are known for their immense wealth that they accumulated over the years in gold and other minerals. But these societies would not have been possible to form without agriculture. But it's amazing what they were able to accomplish without the technology of Europe and Asia and being separated for so long. Uh, None of it would have been possible, again, without agriculture. So once crops spread from the locations of the Aztecs, Inca, and Mayan centers, the crops spread across Central to North America, forming new civilizations. One of the first is in the American Southwest, and that's known as the Pueblo people. They would carve out the side of mountains and build their Pueblo settlements. They also used that corn to feed their people. Slowly, the food made its way across the rest of the Americas into the Ohio River Valley, where the Mississippian tribe thrived. The Mississippian tribe, this is a kind of a depiction that artists believe their capital looked like. You can see the ziggurat, or what is called, what's known as kind of the religious center in the center of the town. And the priests of the Mississippian tribe really is what it was centered around. Uh, the reason why they were praised so much is they believe that their connection to the gods enabled them to grow crops so frequently and so well. And that allowed them to build a massive settlement and a massive civilization. Interestingly, once there was a mini ice age and the degrees dropped just enough to not be able to grow their food as plentifully and as able to support a large population, the Mississippian tribe fragments and spreads across the rest of the eastern seaboard. You also have the Iroquois Confederacy forming in the Northeast once crops and agriculture reaches there. And that's a combination of several tribes. One interesting note about them is that they have a matriarchal society where women were able to control kind of the politics inside of their city, and also they were the ones who just kind of drove the decision making. So, looking at this map of the Americas, one question that we need to be able to ask and answer is why did some regions develop larger civilizations than others? Of course, rivers and the ability to develop agriculture is a big reason for that. In the Northeast or on the eastern seaboard of America, you can see a lot of tribes, and again, the fact they're able to grow crops so well, there is a reason why they were able to have so many different civilizations. In the Northwest, near the plateau area where you see the Chinook and Tillamook people, there weren't as many large societies. And interestingly, that's because they had an abundance of too much food and too many animals they could hunt. And so because of that, they didn't have to rely on building a large society to keep their people fed and surviving. Uh, on the Great Plains, you also have a complete lack of ability to grow agriculture because there aren't as many rivers and there's not the ability to grow crops. And so you have a lot of nomadic people there who will eventually, once the Europeans arrive, adopt horses and just follow buffalo herds. So why do larger civilizations form? A lot of it has to do with geography, near water, and the ability to have agriculture, where there is either not the necessity to have a large-scale agriculture to survive, or where there is the inability to grow crops, you have no large civilizations there. So we introduce Europe in this time because we have the Native Americans settling, but what brings Europeans over across the ocean? So originally you have the Norse, or what most would call the Vikings, finding some areas. But once they abandon their exploration, most Europeans are scared because of the lack of understanding the wind patterns on the ocean. That caused them to get lost in the doldrums and disappear. And that's why we had the flat earth theories of people disappearing, and why we had stories of large sea monsters consuming these ships, is because really they would just go off into the ocean, and the lack of winds would have them be lost at sea forever, and they would just perish. So what encouraged them to push back past this fear of going west? Well, first you have the collapse of trade with India and Eastern Asian markets. And this happens because Constantinople fell to the Muslim Empire and is turned into Istanbul. And when they were cut off from these luxuries and these goods that they'd gotten used to, they began looking for ways around them because they did not want to have to pay the prices Muslims were charging them. They also have intrigued interest by stories from Marco Polo, who was able to travel around Africa into those Asian markets. And he told them that, of what was over there beyond what they could have even dreamed of. So both their kind of interest and the lack of access to cheaper prices for the goods that they enjoyed pushed them to explore. And so one of these men, the man depicted in the picture there, Henry the Navigator, he also discovers new tech in the sails in ships called caravels, which enabled them to better manage the winds. And so they're able to then explore around the tip of Africa. And on this map, you can see Vasco da Gama and Diaz reaching all the way around the tip of Africa into the Indian region. The problem with this, however, as much as they enjoyed exploring, is it was really expensive to do these trips. Even though they're getting around the Muslim middlemen in Constantinople, they still have to spend a lot of money and resources to make it around Africa. And so Europeans began thinking, how could we find a better way to get to those markets without having to go around Africa or pay the prices to our rivals and enemies, the Muslims? Side note, you also have, as they explore up and down the coast of Portugal, establishing trade relationships with Africans, and that does lead to the creation of slave trade. That's more around the mid to late 1600s, as the sugar trade grows in the Americas, but that is a ways away, and something we'll talk more about in future chapters. So Spanish are the first to find the New World, and that's because they fund Columbus's trip. They are able to conquer a group of Muslim invaders in their mind called the Moors. And when they do, they think to themselves, how can we compete with our neighbor, the Portuguese, in establishing trade and making a lot of money now that we have our country united under Catholic rule? So they are approached by the explorer Christopher Columbus, who promises them that he knows that the world is actually smaller than they assume. See, the world, or Europeans didn't actually believe in the flat Earth theory. What it was is they thought that the ocean to the west was too large for them to make it around to India. But Columbus thought that he had studied the stars better than anyone else and knew that the world and that ocean was small enough for him to make it. And so he convinces them that he knows what he's doing, so they fund his trip to what will later be known as the West Indies. It wasn't India at all, it was the Americas in a completely new world, but he spent most of his life convinced that he had found India. With that said, when he finds the natives that live there, he calls them Indians, and it is a people called the Taino people who are giving and generous and receiving of them. The problem is that they did have some gold on their island, and that pushed Columbus and the Spanish to think, how can we find the rest of this gold for ourselves, though, so we can become the wealthiest and most powerful nation in Europe? When he makes it there, it begins the beginning of what we call the Columbian Exchange or the Columbus Exchange. So on this chart, you see many goods going back and forth from the New World, which is America, to the Old World. And then, of course, Africa will eventually bring slave labor to the New World. But focusing on some of the key items going back and forth, for the New World, you have gold and silver going to the Old World. As the Spanish find the gold and silver from these kingdoms like the Aztecs and Incas, it encourages them to travel more and more, and it also brings a lot of interest from other European nations. You also have the exchange of new crops to Europe. Corn, potatoes were two of the most well, I guess, world-changing crops to reach Europe because it allowed for a population boom over the next several centuries that strengthened Europe as they began their age of exploration. As far as the most important things reaching the New World, you have horses changing the lives of many Native Americans. You have different animals which also help feed peoples. Wheat, of course, will make a big difference. Sugar becomes one of the most profitable crops. But out of all the things that come from the old world to the new world that vastly changes their lives, it is these diseases. Smallpox, measles, the plague, flu, typhus, all these different illnesses end up with a death rate of 90% for Native Americans, making them a lot easier to conquer and, of course, making them afraid of Europeans and enabling them to easily build their empires without much resistance. So speaking of conquest, demands for sugar from the New World caused the West Indies immediately to become plantations. In order to work plantations on these islands, they needed a large labor force. Initially, they used the Native Americans who lived there. They enslaved them in a system known as encomienda. Encomienda basically means a commendation. The government would commend or give land to people in order to grow sugar and make money for Spain. So the government says you're allowed to treat these Native Americans and enslave them as long as you're Christianizing. In fact, the Pope himself gave the crown of Spain the ability to do this because, again, the idea was they're saving their souls. So even if they don't live long lives and they spend their lives laboring for Spain and for their kingdom, at least they have heaven at the end of their lives. So Spain kind of excused themselves from this mistreatment by saying they were saving their souls. So many Spaniards did believe it was best for them, but one man who you'll read about in your chapter activities, Bartolome de las Casas, he owned an encomienda and had enslaved Native Americans until he finally realized just how bad their lives were and that they needed to be treated better because they were humans. And so he sells off his encomienda, becomes a Catholic priest, and spends the rest of his life writing and arguing for better treatment of Native Americans. This brings us to the overall conquering of the mainland of the Americas, especially including Central and South America. Spaniards come to conquer the New World with three major ideas in mind. First is God, spread God's message, specifically the Catholic Church message. Collect the gold that these kingdoms have for power. And then, of course, you have the glory. The fact that we know the names of these conquerors tells you that they achieved the glory that they were looking for, that their names would be remembered 500 plus years after they were done with their deeds. So you have Hernan Cortez. He's the very first and probably the most famous of the conquistadors because he defeats the powerful Aztec Empire. Why was a man like Cortez able to defeat an empire with only a few hundred men at his disposal? When he arrives at Tenochtitlan, which is the capital of the Aztecs, they believe that the Spaniards were gods come to basically give them a message and a purpose. And so they gladly kind of tolerated the Spaniards, even though the Spaniards got rid of their religion or tried to tell them that they had to convert to Catholicism. Over time, however, they decided to kick the Spaniards out because of the realization that they were just humans trying to control them. Unfortunately for them, diseases ravaged their population and strongly weakened their ability to resist. And because the Aztecs were so cruel to the nations around them and had controlled, subjugated, and sacrificed many of them, because of that, the Aztecs are supported by every other tribe in the region against them. And so they're forced to surrender to the Spaniards, and Cortez conquers a massive empire of millions of people. Then you have Francisco Pizarro, who marches to Peru, and he pillages the Inca kingdom. How is he able to do this? Well, he tricked them in by keeping their king captive, telling them to give them all of the gold, or at least fill up a massive room of gold, and then he would let the king free. After that happens, he then executes the emperor of the Incan Empire, and then because of diseases and other reasons, the empire just collapses. So Pizarro and Cortez are both able to conquer these massive civilizations by disease and, of course, just some kind of luck. With that said, others followed Ponce de Leon in Florida, Coronado through the southwest, and Hernando de Soto in the southeast. They all explored and looked for gold or looked for the Fountain of Youth, but all of them had different interactions with the Native Americans, especially Hernando de Soto. They were not always pleasant, De Soto being the cruelest of the conquistadors. So as Spain begins controlling these lands and gaining this territory for themselves, their empire grows very quickly. But this causes other nations in Europe to get a little jealous, and they push to compete with Spain. And so these other nations begin exploring. As the rivalries grow and others are competing with them, the Spanish choose to build forts to better hold their positions. One of the very first areas that they control, let me go back to that last map, is St. Augustine in 1565 in Florida. That's technically the first permanent settlement in what's the current United States. And they built that so that they could protect the land and toward the north of their main empire around Mexico City. So after they build those forts, others continue to come and compete. And one story I'll tell you, the French built a little settlement called Fort Caroline. And when they built it, it was a group of French Huguenots or Protestants who were escaping religious persecution. Unfortunately for them, they built their fort too close to the coast. And when the Spanish see it, they stop and harass Fort Caroline, telling them that they have to convert to Catholicism. When those Frenchmen refuse, they are then slaughtered by the Spanish. So these rivalries turned violent pretty quickly, and there's always or in many ways, a religious edge. Not always, but many times a religious edge to it. So the empire was not easy, and it comes at a cost, both to the natives and the Spanish themselves, especially with the Pueblo people in the southwest. You can see on this map, you see Santa Fe by the Colorado River in modern-day New Mexico. So what happens out there is when the Spanish want to build a northern part of their empire in what is now the American Southwest, they establish control at Santa Fe. And the man they put in charge of establishing the hold of the area is Juan de Oñate. He abuses the Pueblo people and forces them to basically give up all of their culture, to become Catholic, to become their slaves working in the area. Years later, an Indian named Pope leads a rebellion against the Spanish in 1680. And surprisingly, he's actually able to push the Spanish completely out of the area. When the Spanish return, however, they work out a deal that forces the natives to be Catholic. However, they're able to keep their own cultural practices, and they're no longer slaves. Rather, they just have to give some of the profits of their crops and their goods to the Spanish to be their subjects. So interestingly, I do want to note that this is an exception in Native American history. Typically, they are not able to expel Europeans from their area. And second, typically when Europeans or later Americans return, they're mistreated. So it's interesting to see that the Pueblo people are able to build a more positive relationship with the Spanish over time. So the final part of this is the Spanish effect on Native Americans more positive or negative? The general idea here is that the Spanish, most believe that the Spanish only murdered, pillaged, and ruined Native people's ways of life. And there is a lot of fairness to that statement because diseases ravage 90%, the empires fall and are under Spanish control. And the reason it's called the Black Legend is because Catholic priests like Bartolome de las Casas spreads these ideas amongst Europeans. But you have to understand that European powers like England and France and others wanted to vilify the Spanish to undermine people's views of them and undermine their power in the European landscape. So one positive thing about Spanish and natives is over time they intermingle with them. When we look at English later on, the English did not mingle with natives. They're always pushed, or not always, but almost always pushed out of their settlements. They're not allowed to integrate in English culture. And when you think about American history and our desire to push them further west away from their own lands, that is very much not what the Spanish did. The Spanish instead, over time, mingled with them to form a class of people called mestizo. When you look at Cortez's army, many of his officers and officers that followed Cortez, they married natives. You don't see that happen often with the English that arrive later. So after a few centuries, the Spanish and the natives are really one people in the New World, unlike Americans and English who continue to keep them separate. In the 1700s, the Spanish also built a chain of Catholic missions on the coast of California. And that was the idea to leave a lasting religious presence in the New World and on Native Americans. So when we look at the Spanish in total, it certainly starts off badly and for a long time is. Diseases ravage their people, and then of course you have the conquistadors coming and taking advantage of the dwindling and suffering population. But over time, we do see the Spanish merge with Native Americans in the New World, becoming a singular people. Regardless of your feelings on the Spanish and European interaction here, the cultural exchange between these two sides changed the world forever. And Europe, through the wealth and power gained from their exchanges with the New World, is really what enables them over the next few centuries to become the prominent continent and peoples across the globe. So that's it for chapter 1. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me a message and we can discuss your questions. Have a good one.